Good day, everyone. My name is Hasleila Ramirez. I am from Colombia, and I am part of FINI, supporting the Island Fund. It's such a pleasure for me to be here with you today. Thanks for being here. Thanks for giving us your time and overall your presence and your attention. Let's start. First of all, I want to introduce you the spiritual invocation. This is a blessing provided by our sister Terilyn Francisco. She is Indigenous Chamorro woman of Guam in Pacific region. Terilyn Francisco belongs to the Ihagan Famalo Uagan, a non-profit organization of Chamorro women, girls and people within the overall Guagan community. The blessing to be chanted is entitled It to Home, which translates to the beginning.
Half a day and warm greetings to everyone. It is an honor to be in this space of sisterhood and solidarity. To echo many voices thus far of the Second World Indigenous Women's Conference, although there may be many challenges and endeavors that we must continue to face as women in our communities, there is also great hope in our commitment to the love and support we have for one another. As spoken in our introduction, we are Indigenous Chamorro women from Guam, an island in the North Pacific. And today we'd like to share a piece of our people's creation story in the form of a chant. In these few moments, we remember our oneness as humanity. Peace and love to you all.
Gitimi Tuhan, get halam hinasam isa kulala. Gitimi Tuhan.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Caroline, for this beautiful blessing. Okay, before we start with the session, we would like to share some information for access and enjoyment of the platform. Please remember to check the social news, notification, and spam folders of your emails, because sometimes the emails of the conference can arrive of those other folders. It cannot be sometimes in inbox to find the email that we are sending you with the information to access to the platform or to Zoom. This way you can verify that the communication is reaching you. We also ask for your cooperation because the requests for technical support are many for us, and the total number of people at this conference is approximately of 800 people. So it's sometimes quite difficult. We are providing technical support through this email to wciw@iiwf.org. Okay, as for the agenda, on the first day, as you maybe remember, we analyzed the priorities, demands, and shared sustainable practices led by Indigenous women at different levels. Today, we'll be dedicated to analyze the human rights framework of Indigenous women under the motto that we have embraced: nothing about us without us. The struggle for recognition in the national territories has been arduous and long. However, Indigenous women have been firmly committed to defend and to promote the realization of their rights as women and also as Indigenous people, guardians of their territories and guarantors of the ancestral wisdom of their peoples. Having said that, I am blessed to introduce you Mrs. Ellen Dictahan Bank Oa Kankane Igorot leader. She has been engaged into a series of capacity building activities for Indigenous women in Asia, focused on Committee of Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Women, a process that involves Indigenous women's realization and the analysis of the sources of their marginalization and other situations of gender discrimination at the community level. Mrs. Ellen has also been involved in mentoring and accompaniment of Asia Indigenous Women Network, members to different processes such as the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, Climate Change, Regional Consultation on Women, among others, as part of the strengthening their knowledge and skills in advocacy work. One little recommendation, because we want to ask a favor to the panelists that please talk not so fast for purposes of translation and interpretation services. Please, Mrs. Ellen, take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Has. Good morning, everyone in Asia, and good evening to our sisters and brothers from the other regions. Welcome to this opening panel entitled From the Local to the Global Agenda, the Role of Indigenous Women in Monitoring and Implementing International Instruments. I am Eleanor Dictaan Bangwa, ang Kanaoy Igorot from the Cordillera region in the Philippines. The Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women which entered into force in the 1980s, was a welcome move for indigenous women in general. Except for Iran, all countries in the Asia-Pacific region ratified the CEDAW. The policies, structures, and programs operationalizing the CEDAW at the national level provided space for indigenous women and their agencies to call for redress to our situations by state authorities and other agencies, as well as within our own communities and organizations. On the other hand, it also created a sense of ambivalence, especially in locating it in the community struggles against colonial and post-colonial repression and oppression, nationalism, and political autonomy. Albeit slow and still in the margins, we cannot deny that there has been progress in the status of indigenous women hence. From the first International Indigenous Women's Conference in Australia in the 1980s to this conference, indigenous women from all parts of the globe have been braving challenges and risks to come together in this time in a totally new platform to share, learn, and advance forward. Today, there are various international legal frameworks, processes, and mechanisms that can be used as tools to advance the rights and status of indigenous women. We have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples already, the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, a mechanism with whom we are engaging towards the elaboration of the rights of indigenous women and girls through a general recommendation. We also have the Commission on the Status of Women, the SDGs, and the International Decade of Indigenous Languages that will commence next year, among others. All these are indicators of progress from the unceasing struggles of indigenous women to be heard and to be recognized. 8 years ago in Lima, indigenous women committed to continue asserting the right to self-determination, which encompasses the direct, full, and effective participation of indigenous peoples, including the vital role of indigenous women in all matters related to our human rights, political status, and well-being. We endorse the principle, nothing about us without us, and further declare that everything about us with us. This panel aims to steer us to reflect on how international instruments have been useful as advocacy tools. Have we been using these instruments to advance our stakes and our rights as indigenous women, especially at the national level? What advances were made and what challenges are there? How do we further cascade these tools to the local and national level and use them to our advantage, especially in the light of the current commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals? Another indicator of progress is personified in everyone gathered in this conference and the synergy to transform challenges to victories. I am very honored to be in this panel today with exemplary women from our very own region, personifying indigenous women's struggles. They have been very instrumental in the progress that we are enjoying today by taking on notable and strategic positions while leading in their various capacities as indigenous women in local to global negotiating and decision-making spaces. Unfortunately, they each have only 2 minutes to respond, but we do hope to maximize the space through the chat box, where participants can share comments from their own experiences and the interactive discussion that will follow the speakers. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Ms. Victoria Tauni-Corpus. Vicky, as Panglico, is an indigenous leader from the Kankanai Igor people of the Cordillera region in the Philippines. She is a social development consultant, an indigenous activist, a civic leader, a human rights expert, a public servant, who have been trailblazing the assertion of indigenous women and people's rights in all her engagements. She is the founder and executive director of the Foundation, or the Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education. She has chaired the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, followed by her recently ended service as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Vicky, from your very rich experiences as an activist, asserting and negotiating for Indigenous peoples' rights with different governments and entities, what is your assessment of the use of international instruments as advocacy tools, specifically by Indigenous women? Is the progress made at the international level taken on to address the realities of Indigenous women on the ground? Please, Vicky.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and thank you to FEMI for organizing this conference. It's a very historical event because, again, we are able to gather together to look back into what we have achieved so far, as well as understand better what the situation of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous women are today. I have to apologize for the blackout in my office, so I'm just using the energy that's left. But nevertheless, I'd like to say that, you know, the work that Indigenous women have achieved in terms of using the international mechanisms and spaces is really remarkable. No? We started when we were still negotiating the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There was not many, still it was still dominated by men, but we had very strong women who were part of the drafting, as well as the negotiations that followed after the declaration has been adopted by the Human Rights Commission and it was brought to the attention of the General Assembly. I must tell you that it was not an easy thing to put in Articles 21 and 22 in the UN Declaration, which are the articles directly referring to Indigenous women, because there has been some resistance also on the part of some men. In fact, I still remember Antonio Hakaninhoy, who just passed away from COVID now, who was challenging me, saying, at that time, I think he was the head of OICA, and he was challenging me and saying that, Vicky, you have to make a decision whether you would like to respect the cultural rights of Indigenous peoples, or just, or by insist, or just insist on the rights of Indigenous women. So there was a debate that followed. Of course, the good thing is that many states who have signed on to CEDAW have agreed to support the articles that we were pushing for. Celeste, I remember Celeste Smith from Canada, who was one of those who was working very closely with me. So anyhow, I think the gains that we have achieved in terms of getting those articles in place, in terms of ensuring that the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the expert mechanism, have equal numbers of men and women participating as experts in those bodies. And of course, my appointment in the past as the UN Special Rapporteur had pushed, the issue of gender equality and the issue of violence against Indigenous women into the center of many of the discussions. I recall very much the efforts of Indigenous women to use the international treaties, and one of the first ones was a Canadian Indigenous woman and a First Nations woman who challenged the provision, I think, in the Indian Act, which says that if you marry a non-Indigenous man, then you lose your citizenship in your own reservation, no? And this was challenged under the Human Rights Committee, and then this was, of course, addressed by the committee itself. That is clearly a discrimination against Indigenous women. I went through some of the decisions done by several of these treaties, and one of the things that I saw as far as Asia is concerned was also the Thailand Indigenous women, the hill tribes, no? They challenged, in a shadow report that was submitted to CEDAW, they challenged the Thailand government for not giving them citizenship no, as Thai citizens. And there was a strong recommendation from CEDAW that the Thai government should provide citizenship rights to the Hill tribe women of Thailand. So there are many of these, and I would like to refer you to the book that was published by Asia Indigenous Women's Network, the Forest People's Program in Tutuba, which was published in 2013, no, and it contains the references to many of these cases that were discussed, as well as instructions on how to use these international mechanisms to push for the rights of indigenous women. And finally, the latest development, of course, is the effort of CEDAW to come up with a general comment on indigenous women. And we are wanting them to push for this, and we should get actively engaged with them. I think the participation that we had in 1995 at the Beijing 4th International Conference on Women is really instrumental in bringing into the picture many of the indigenous women that have emerged as leaders, no? And that's where we came up with our Beijing Declaration of Indigenous Women and pushed for the references that were there in the declaration as well as for the plan of action. So I'm very glad that we are able to do that. The Asia Indigenous Women's Network organized the 10, and that's how we come together and continued the efforts that we are doing now. And of course, the existence of FIMI is an evidence that we are there. We are actively engaged in the research, in the debates, as well in the use of these mechanisms and spaces. And I would like to urge everybody to do that. But I think that the key step is to really educate our women from the local up to the global levels. The local levels, we have also achieved successes, and many of these will be shared by you later. So thank you very much again for organizing this event, and I apologize if at the middle of this thing I will disappear because there is no more power from our internet connection. Thank you, and good afternoon and good morning to everybody. Good evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vicky, for highlighting the victories in the struggle of indigenous peoples and women, no? And that within ourselves as indigenous peoples, there's also a struggle within that we have to respond to. We have been, so in short, that this brings me to the reflection of somebody saying that we have to be on the table to be able to put our concerns forward. Otherwise, we will be the menu. No? So in consideration of the time and hopefully to allow more interaction during the interactive discussion, I will directly proceed to our next speaker, Ms. Tanya Tarki. Tanya is a Quechua leader, a social worker, and a human rights activist. As an activist, she works largely to establish social equality for indigenous youth and women. Currently, she leads the Chirapac's Indigenous Women's Program with a view to strengthening the participation of indigenous women and youth in the development of public policies. Chirapac, or the Centro de Culturas Indígenas del Perú, is an indigenous association formed by Andean and Amazonian people who work for the affirmation of the cultural identity and the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples. She was elected to the Congress of the Republic of Peru, serving as the representative of the Department of Ayacucho. Tanya, at your very young age, engaging in all these platforms and with your different hats, and the passion for the advancement of indigenous women and youth. What challenges have you faced regarding your advocacy work within the international framework? Tanya, please.
Imaykamuñaykichik kuyasqallañañaykuna, lliw suyukunamanta pacha hamkunapa hatuna paykuynita, llapallaykichikpaq. Muy buenas noches, buenas tardes, buenos días, en los distintos territorios de los continentes, a todas mis queridas hermanas, un gran saludo, y a las que se conectan de los diferentes puntos de los continentes para participar de este evento que gracias al esfuerzo de todas las redes de mujeres indígenas es posible. Yo quiero comentar desde mi experiencia personal en el trabajo de incidencia política, desde el nivel local, nacional, también internacional, algunas reflexiones que yo creo que es importante colocarlas en este debate, ¿verdad? ¿Cómo seguimos caminando para que nuestros derechos no sigan relegados y que sean más bien la incidencia y el instrumento para transformar nuestras vidas, las condiciones en las que actualmente nuestros pueblos se encuentran? Hay avances significativos en el reconocimiento de nuestros derechos como mujeres y pueblos indígenas en el plano internacional, gracias al liderazgo y la convicción de nuestras hermanas que nos antecedieron y caminaron en una sola fuerza en los distintos continentes, venciendo barreras culturales, lingüísticas, logísticas, venciendo también el patriarcado, el machismo y las estructuras coloniales y también las normas excluyentes. El proceso de Beijing+5 es un claro ejemplo de incidencia de las mujeres indígenas y es un referente importante para la nueva generación, para las jóvenes que hemos empezado a caminar en estos escenarios, y después de hace 25 años, hoy hacemos un balance concienzudo justamente para no quedar atrás ni nada sin nosotras. Un proceso previo para la incidencia es el acceso a la información, la capacitación, el conocimiento de los derechos en su dimensión individual y colectiva, tener las herramientas que nos permitan hacer una efectiva incidencia y sobre todo tener las propuestas claras. Todo este proceso para las mujeres indígenas no es fácil. Existen aún brechas y desigualdades a las que nos enfrentamos que requieren subsanarse. Por ejemplo, el acceso a la tecnología, la inversión en programas de empoderamiento de las mujeres, el acceso a oportunidades de educación, de formación superior. Sin embargo, ante toda barrera, las mujeres indígenas tomamos iniciativas, nos organizamos, trabajamos por nuestra autonomía física, económica. Y por otro lado, lograr ser incluidas en un documento de resolución, de recomendación internacional, es un gran paso, pero necesitamos trabajar en su implementación a nivel nacional y local. Por ejemplo, proponer las leyes y las normas con enfoque intercultural e interseccional. La traducción de políticas públicas, que estos tengan presupuesto y recursos humanos, y lo más importante, que signifiquen la mejora de las condiciones de vida de las mujeres y de nuestras comunidades. A este largo camino a la que hemos nosotros asistido y participado de forma activa, necesitamos agregarle hoy un sistema de monitoreo periódico de estas recomendaciones, de estas resoluciones, de estos tratados y acuerdos internacionales que son de alta relevancia para nuestros derechos como mujeres indígenas en los 3 niveles, local, nacional e internacional. El foro permanente cuenta con por lo menos 1.500 recomendaciones en las distintas áreas y es importante saber cuántos de estos compromisos realmente se cumplen, cuántos de estos los estados lo están asumiendo como parte de su política de gobierno, de su política pública. ¿Cuántos de ellos son parte de los indicadores nacionales de evaluación frente a la pobreza en los documentos de acuerdos intergubernamentales o multisectoriales? Entonces, estamos hoy con el desafío de construir este sistema también de monitoreo periódico desde nuestras propias capacidades y de lo que nosotros consideramos que son esos indicadores que van a transformar nuestras vidas. El aumento de las violencias hacia nosotras por nuestra condición indígena es un punto central en el trabajo de incidencia, para que los organismos de justicia cambien de enfoque y no sea la impunidad la respuesta a todas las denuncias y a todos los atropellos que hoy vienen sufriendo hermanas indígenas en todas partes del mundo. Existen buenas prácticas y ejemplos de réplica en la lucha contra las violencias desde las mujeres indígenas con enfoque intercultural en territorios indígenas en ámbitos urbanos, con colectivos de abogadas y juristas que vienen generando un precedente desde el pluralismo jurídico. Sin embargo, estas todavía no son traducidas en políticas públicas y he ahí el desafío de nosotras para que estas buenas prácticas nos conlleven también a ampliar esta cobertura, a ampliar esta valiosa experiencia para atender este gran flagelo de la violencia contra las mujeres indígenas. Tenemos el desafío de lograr la igualdad sustantiva en la representación política de las mujeres indígenas en los espacios de poder legislativo, ejecutivo y judicial. Mi experiencia parlamentaria me ha enseñado que si nuestra voz no está en el Parlamento, no están en estos espacios decisorios, nuestras aspiraciones quedan muy cortas, nuestros sueños y nuestro enfoque quedan también relegados de esas grandes reformas de leyes y reformas constitucionales. Y es importante estar allí con presencia y con voz. Y hoy se habla de la paridad de género, pero sabemos que esta no está significando necesariamente la inclusión de mujeres indígenas y por eso necesitamos reiterar que la paridad debe aplicarse con enfoque étnico, racial e intergeneracional y así lograr una verdadera representación política. La participación intergeneracional, por ende, en los espacios de toma de decisión es clave y fundamental para la continuidad de las luchas y reivindicaciones de los derechos como mujeres y pueblos indígenas. Otra de las, en todo caso, recomendaciones que compartimos como un aprendizaje también, la elaboración de reportes y estos informes sombra o alternativos ante las instancias internacionales en Ginebra, a nivel interamericano y otros, tiene que venir desde el recojo de información desde lo local, desde las voces de hermanas que viven la realidad concreta en el ámbito rural, periurbano, también las capitales de las grandes ciudades. Es decir, esta interacción del proceso local y global es un proceso también de empoderamiento interno de las comunidades. Por ejemplo, el compromiso que pueden construir las autoridades comunitarias para cambiar la discriminación de género, abordar la violencia, revitalizar la lengua y la identidad indígena con la infancia y la juventud. Y bueno, finalmente yo quiero sumarme a ese llamado que hace nuestra hermana Victoria Tauli para que este gran trabajo que hemos emprendido de la inclusión de las recomendaciones específicas sobre los derechos de las mujeres indígenas por el Comité para la Eliminación de todas las formas de discriminación contra la mujer CEDAW, sea una demanda sentida colectiva de todas las mujeres indígenas del mundo y que podamos hacer nuestra esta consigna para que esas recomendaciones sean un hecho real y que desde nuestros territorios empecemos a levantar nuestra voz, nuestros rostros, nuestra lucha, y que esta alianza multiactor para incidir también nos demanda, ¿verdad?, el acercamiento con otros movimientos sociales, con parlamentarias indígenas, que hoy también tenemos cierta presencia en algunos países de hermanas asumiendo estos puestos, comunicadores, la academia, así como activistas de derechos humanos. Es decir, necesitamos tejer esta alianza diversa que sume también sus voces a la gran lucha que hemos emprendido las mujeres indígenas. Muchas gracias a todas por la escucha, un gran abrazo.
Thank you very much, Tanya. It's really touching how young Indigenous women have taken on the struggle, no, as part of actually as part of their whatever career they have gotten into. But following Tanya, we have Sandra Creamer, who is one of our sisters from Australia who have been working in the legal realm. No? Sandra is a Wanyi Kalkadun woman, is currently the interim Chief Executive Officer of the National Aboriginal and Torres Straits Islander Women's Alliance, and an adjunct professor with the University of Queensland and professor of law at the Coorey Institute of Education at Deakin University. She started as the Indigenous Community Liaison Officer with the Legal Aid Queensland, working with Indigenous women and children who were victims of crime. As an Indigenous lawyer and a human rights advocate, she believes in the importance of educating Indigenous peoples on their rights so that they can learn how to challenge laws and policies that are affecting their communities. This includes translating the language of law so that Indigenous people can understand it for their benefit. Sandra, in your practice as an Indigenous woman lawyer and educator, there can be a lot of challenges trying to marry Indigenous law and tradition, pluralism, as Tanya has referred to earlier, with the mainstream or legal system. What significant lessons can you share with us today in relation to your work defending the individual and collective rights of Indigenous women? Sandra, please.
Good morning, and thank you very much. Warm greetings to everyone joining us here today for the special conference. I first begin by recognising the Indigenous people's land that I'm on today, the Durrumbal land, and also all the Indigenous lands and territories that you are all on today, to honour our ancestors. My name is Sandra Creamer. I am the CEO of the National Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Women's Alliance and adjunct professor for public health in Queensland and a lawyer. I'd like to thank all the other panellists and FEMI in bringing the voices of our Indigenous women from around the world. It can be an isolating journey for us at the moment with COVID, and it is important to collaborate together. I just want to provide some background of our rights in Australia. As Indigenous peoples, we are not in the Constitution. We do not have treaties and we do not have a Bill of Rights, though some states are starting to implement that. Because of this, then we have to look at different certain rights here in Australia. And that's where our international rights can come in place. And as women, we know that we face many challenges as a collective, and it is important for us to continue to be visible and to continue to make our issues at the table. And it is important for us as Indigenous women to stand collectively to challenge the systems, laws and policies for our self-reliance. In Australia, we have our Racial Discrimination Act, which we use quite often in the legal system. And this was implanted in Australia with the International Prevention of Elimination Racial Discrimination. So that then became part of our law in our Racial Discrimination Act. And this was effective for us in our Racial Discrimination Act. Though today I'm going to talk about another area that I actually do use in my work, and I think that is really important. I'm going to talk briefly about the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples and the possibilities that it has for us, which is an international human rights instrument that creates a comprehensive standalone framework and that defines our rights. And it has 41 articles. And for me, that is the new order of the day for the 143 nations around the world. We must inject the human rights principles and frameworks and to show that responsibilities for us as Indigenous peoples, women and children. Though we know that in Australia in particular, it's not legally binding or enforceable, but we know that we need to use the United Nations declarations for us as a vehicle to strengthen our rights. We are at a crossroad, so this declaration is a force for us, for our rights into the 21st century and for our self-determination. We have challenged the current legal system in Australia many times for our self-determination. So for us to advance any further, we at times have to turn to the UN Declaration to be part of our lifeline and to make our legal culture more just. The UN Declaration is specifically designed to solve these hard-to-solve social harms through the human rights framework. So what I'm going to talk about is how I've injected the human rights principles from the Declaration and other instrument framework and mechanisms to strengthen Indigenous women that I work with in Australia. One of the groups that I work with is out in the Central Desert of Australia, and they have terrible access to fresh water. So in my role as an adjunct professor, I have worked with these women in these remote communities. And so what happens out in out in those communities, one of them has won their native title battle after a long battle. And all they wanted to do was start a business. But between them, all that was standing between them was water security. In our remote communities, they have bore water. That is water from under the ground, and that water contains sulfur. So in order for them to have water, they have to get funding to install tanks. And some of our remote communities don't have that sort of money to be able to do this. This is why it's a very big issue for me when it comes to water security. And by installing these water tanks, it will then be the only fresh water that is provided to them when it's a raining time. But it's a common story for us as Indigenous peoples here in Australia and for our Indigenous peoples around the world when it comes to water security. And it's also, for us in Australia, it's also an issue that regards to our land. For people to have any basic rights such as water, medical, for health, in their remote communities, the government then want them to sign a 99-year lease. We don't want them to sign out a 99-year lease just to have that basic service. As Indigenous people, we should have the rights as anybody else in urban areas to have health, education, electricity, and to be able to have access to fresh water. And this is why I inject the Human Rights Declaration and principles into the work that I do, so that I can encourage people to understand what their rights are and continue to challenge the legal system what their rights are and to assert that rights, because when we do that, we can make changes. There's 500 million Indigenous peoples in the world. We are the largest human rights group in the world, and we are the ones who are making changes through the legal system and policies. So we have to use these different international instruments, mechanisms, and the United Nations declarations for Indigenous peoples. But for us, we know there are always barriers and we have hardships, but we still have to use our rights to work together and to support this. We have to do this by writing submissions, going to the United Nations, or even taking on legal battles, which can be a long, drawn-out process. For us in Australia, sometimes for us to get our recognition as being an Indigenous person to our own land, it can be a long legal process, which can take up to 10 years sometimes. We may not see each other as sisters in this world at this moment, but I want us to remember, even though we are living remotely or living distance or we don't have any face-to-face, we are here to be a voice, and we must remember that for those who are invisible, we must be able to speak for them and to let them know what their rights are and to be able to speak and to show them what their rights are. We must not forget each other, our issues, and who we are as Indigenous peoples and women. We have to be at the table, and we need to be able to continue to challenge the challenges that have continually faced us for many generations. Laws were not put in place, policies were not put in place. We were all written off around the world. But it is through making challenges in the legal system, especially, that we've been able to implement different changes, that we've been able to set down precedents so that we can all use around the world when we're challenged in the courts, And it's very important that we also understand and know what our rights are and to continue to challenge the system. There are times when we're going to lose, but you know what? There are times when we are going to win, and we have been winning, and we are making changes. And as hard as it may get, and as dark as the road may be, we have to continue to make those challenges for the next seventh generation for us as Indigenous peoples in this world. I'd like to also thank FEMI for putting this conference on, in particular because it's a learning time for us, and it's also a lesson to know our issues as a collective, and we learn from each other, and we also can hear about the solutions that we are creating for our issues. Nothing about us without us. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Yes, Sandra and Tanya have brought out the many challenges, especially of information and the related enabling processes towards appropriate and effective information for Indigenous women, and of course the importance of challenge collective analysis and clear proposals, and the importance of using different instruments together, and especially taking ownership of this in all our advocacies and initiatives. I would like to open the floor for discussion to the participants for discussion. I don't see so much questions from the chat box, but I would like to encourage people who would like to ask to raise their hands in this case. There's a comment from India, from Basavi Kiro. She says that, yes, we have many international tools, but our government does not recognize. In India, we do not have Indigenous people's law in the perspective of the UN treaty. I guess that's just a comment that is true in most of our countries, no? A lot of countries have signed on to the UN treaty, but are lacking in terms of how this is, lacking in terms of its operationalization on the ground. Would anybody of the speakers want to comment on this comment, respond to this comment?
It's Sandra again. Sorry, what was that?
I want to respond, Ellen. Sorry.
Yes, Vicky, please.
Yeah, it's so hard to. Okay. Well, I think that's really a common issue among Indigenous peoples. No, I mean, it doesn't mean that when they have ratified these treaties, it doesn't mean that they are implementing it, and we know for a fact that that's not happening. But that's precisely why we want to educate our women on how to use these instruments, because even if these instruments are not being implemented by the government, they provide complaints mechanisms, no, wherein you can submit your complaint, or you can make a shadow report wherein you can submit a report that will either challenge the report of the government, or if they don't have any report, to raise the issues that we would like to raise. And as I mentioned earlier, there has been some successes in that, you know, like in many situations, like for instance, among the Belize women, they also submitted, the Maya women submitted a complaint to the CEDAW, to the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, because the poverty eradication policies of Belize are not addressing the situation of Maya women. And the CEDAW came up with a recommendation strongly saying that the indigenous women should be included. There should be data on the extent of poverty amongst indigenous women, and they should be included when these poverty eradication designs and programs are being used, are being made. So I think the political participation of indigenous women is really key, and that's why I'm so happy to see Tanya, because she has been a member of parliament. We have also Johnny Lasimbang, who is a member of the Parliament of Malaysia. You know, we have people who are really trying to get into places where decisions are being made, and these women are doing whatever they can. So I think we should not give up. We should continue to challenge the governments. I know in India you challenged the Supreme Court decision, which was going to allow the entry of other populations into the forest where indigenous peoples are dwelling. As a special rapporteur, I made several comments to the Supreme Court of India, and I don't know what the situation is right now, but those are the day-to-day realities that we face. They develop laws that conflict with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and also that are in total disregard of the human rights treaties that they have adopted. So we have to continue challenging this. And I think it's not easy. I mean, you know, we need to have the resources, the people who can pay attention and give their time to this, but that's what we have. And I think that's what also gives us strength, because we know that while these are not being implemented, it's our responsibility to tell them and remind them every time, and to use these instruments that are in place. And I think that there is no shortcut to achieving what we want, but at the end, when we empower ourselves, when we work as collectives, we use these instruments that are in place, and the mechanisms go to the spaces where we need to have our voices heard. That's when we will see these changes, no matter how slow. In the end, it will accumulate, and it will be for our benefit, for the benefit of our future generations and us.
Thank you very much, Vicky. A very related comment here is, let me just read it. Where there is no system in political governance, and without recognition of women or indigenous women, and continuous violation, how the social movement would be promoted? How can the social movement be promoted within these authoritarian restrictions? Yes, I think this is in relation to the general context in Asia, no, where our human rights, there's been a setback in the human rights of generally, no, but especially indigenous peoples.
Can I say something on that again?
Yes, Vicky.
Yes, yes, of course, you know, with increasing now we are witnessing the shrinking of what we call the democratic space in many countries, no? Authoritarian and fascist governments come into power. The latest, of course, are in Asia, the situation in Myanmar, as well as the situation in Afghanistan, no, and where the Taliban are coming back into power, and we know very well how the Taliban are totally, disrespecting the rights of women in general, and that's really very sad, no, in a situation, especially in a situation where we are also facing this pandemic, no. So we really just have to continue doing what we need to do. And I would like, at this point, I would just like to say that, you know, that's one of the reasons why we set up this institution called IPRI, this organization called IPRI, Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, which is meant to address the criminalization and the shrinking democratic spaces in many countries, no? This IPRI has a legal and sanctuary fund, for if you are being criminalized, if you are being tagged as a terrorist, and you are therefore in danger of being arrested and incarcerated, you can seek support from IPRI. You write to them, and you will and state the situation that you are facing, and you can get support in terms of campaign, writing, waging a campaign to support the issue that you are facing, as well as material and technical and political support. Sandra Creamer is the chair of the board of this body, and I helped found this body after I developed a report as a rapporteur on criminalization of indigenous peoples, and it's good for you to know this, so that in case you are faced with those situations, you still have a recourse, outside of the UN bodies. Of course, I'd like just to mention, because I didn't mention in my earlier intervention, the special procedures, The special procedures include all the rapporteurs, the thematic and country rapporteurs, and I'm like my post, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There is also a special rapporteur on violence against women, its causes and consequences, and there is a working group on discrimination against women in law and practice, So there are special procedures where you can also submit your complaints and get these experts, human rights experts, to write to your government and to also get the support of the UN when you are facing such problems. I managed to get some people out of jail, because I wrote to the governments. I helped in launching the campaign. So several, like a Maya person from Guatemala, as well as a person, an indigenous person in Mexico. So this helped. It's just you have to know it. You just have to know what to use and when to use it. And if you want to know more about this, you can reach out to either to all of us here, of course, FIMI, but also to Tubtuba and also to IPRI, and all the networks that you are working with. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. So, and there are some other comments coming in, but this will be the last question in consideration of time. Tanya, and I think this is directed to Tanya and Sandra, to give us their perception. Definitely the struggle of women is very big, but how to think about unity? How can we think about unity, collectivity, when political parties are the main dividers? As they are the main challenges, the political parties, and maybe while they are, maybe you can also opt to respond to this comment on, isn't it time to frame our narratives to challenge the mainstream women movement and state mechanisms, as our issues are diluted by the state in many forms and aspects? Please, Tanya or Sandra, very briefly.
I'll just
Okay,
go very quick. Yeah, sorry. I'll just go very quickly and just answer that. I think one of the things that as Indigenous women, we always still have to be a collective, and there will always be challenges. And as I said, we were written off as Indigenous peoples in this world. There was nothing for any of us. They just wanted to eliminate us. But through the generations, through our ancestors, we've been able to continue to challenge everything. And as women, as a collective, that's why we have FIMI, where we've written into to CEDAW, where we've been able to bat for different things. And that's why I think it's really important, if you go to FIMI's website, IPRI's, like Vicky also said, you'll see the documents that have happened. It's not an easy road at all for us to challenge the systems, but we have to keep challenging them. And as I said, we may lose some, but we are also winning some. And it can be a really daunting, it can be a very hard system when we're making changes. But we are a collective of women, and we are nearly, like I said, 500 million Indigenous people. There's about 200 million Indigenous women. And as you see on this webinar, there's 152 women have attended this webinar. And that makes us a collective to the issues that we're looking at. So I really encourage you to have a look at the websites, write as a collective, reach out to us to what you need to be doing, and have a look at the organizations that we're with to be able to make those challenges and changes. And, you know, that's what we have to do. We just have to keep making challenges because we are rising as Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Tanya, any brief thoughts? Very brief.
Muchas gracias, Eleonor, y a quien planteó esta reflexión a modo de pregunta. Definitivamente es importante hablar de la unidad, la colectividad como movimiento indígena de mujeres y en un nivel mixto para lograr una representación política en los distintos estamentos de poder. Cuando un movimiento es sólido, tiene claridad de sus principios y una agenda indígena trabajada de forma participativa desde lo local a lo nacional, creo que es posible también que estos cambios se den en los marcos legales normativos, por ejemplo, la reforma político-electoral que hoy es totalmente excluyente a los pueblos indígenas. La única manera para lograr un sitio en los parlamentos es a través de un partido político, pero si nosotros tuviéramos la fuerza suficiente para lograr que los pueblos indígenas con nuestros propios mecanismos de elección interna, de elección incluso abierta, primaria, podamos tener esa representación de acuerdo a nuestros usos y costumbres, creo que ese es un gran desafío que tenemos en América Latina también, pero lo más importante es no perder de vista que la representación política es parte de nuestros derechos políticos y que para cambiar las relaciones de poder asimétrica que hoy por hoy imperan en nuestros países y la mayoría de los estados, necesitamos de alguna manera tener una interlocución con estos actores.
Thank you, speakers, for the responses. We're running after time as usual, so I would like to move on from this interactive dialogue to our reactor, Ms. Johnny Lasimbang, a Kadasan Duson from Malaysia. She is the founding member of the PACUS Trust, a group supporting Sabah's indigenous peoples, and has served as the Secretary General of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. She was a commissioner for Sukaham, the Malaysia Human Rights Commission, and also served as Assistant Minister of Law and Native Affairs in Sabah, Malaysia. She is now on her second term as the Kapayan representative to the Sabah State Legislative Assembly. Johnny, with one foot standing as an indigenous woman and human rights advocate, and the other as a government entity, please tell us what thoughts have you been entertaining while listening to the speakers and the discussion that followed. No? Where do you think should we start if we like to influence consistency of national policy to the various international frameworks, especially the UNDRIP and the CEDAW? Johnny, please.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and also thank you to FIMI for organizing this. It's very happy to be part of the movement of women all over the globe. Yes, for me, being in government previously with the international movement very actively, and now with the State Assembly as an opposition member, I was with the Ministry of Law and Native Affairs for some time, a newly created ministry. I think it's really important opportunity to put into practice what we have achieved at the global level. So I could use the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, CEDAW, and many other relevant international instruments to make it into a living and useful document. I managed to, for me personally, and I think that's how we as women who have been active, or as working at the international level and also working at the local level, you can raise issues. For me personally, I brought in an issue, and my advice is not to get into too many issues when you go at the local level or the national level, because you need as much energy as you can, and try to work together with others to bring the other issues. For me personally, I focused on the issue of child marriage. 30% quota on women in all sectors, basically involvement of women, domestic violence, sexual harassment, gender discrimination, and of course also the importance of native courts and the role of women that they play there. In the process of collaboration with UNICEF, for example, and that's how we can bring in UN agencies in our different countries, NGOs, and also government departments. We would manage to form, hold workshops, prepare and lobby for legal and policy amendments, and then also plan programs and allocate budgets to be adopted by governments. For me, I was not very successful together with even that team that was working for the legal amendment to limit the age of marriage of indigenous girls to 18 years without exception, meaning it's just a policy, a flat policy like that. We failed to do that because we cannot get, despite all our lobbying, we cannot get the cabinet to agree to this. So that's the first, actually the first level. We didn't want to give up. So the next step was for us to go to the native courts to ensure that there will be a hearing. Any applications of marriage below 18 years of age. So they have the court have to consider, and this is the native court. We have that in Sabah, and I think a number of other countries. And so we started the process of amending the native court enactment of 1992. After 2 years, we are still pushing for such a simple amendment. So, to me, those are lessons. And another example was for the government in Sabah to adopt a policy of 30% quota for women in all public sectors. In 2019, despite all we have achieved over years in Beijing and at the international level, Sabah still adopted a quota of 20% women in the public sector. And so we started the process to make the government agree to a 30% quota, and this is still ongoing. So we hope, because of the pandemic, there is a lot slower in terms of work, but these are things that we need to go. We need to lobby the assembly, the MPs, to ensure that this will become policy. Because once they are, they will be allocated funds, and we can easily push governments to commit to what they have said for their policy. So that's how I think it's important for us to translate international instrument into national and local levels. So to me, despite all this, the process we have gained can be, allies, making allies at the UN agencies, community organizations, committed government officials. Sometimes we may fail, but if we manage to identify committed government officials, just like when we go to the international, level, we will find committed, speakers to our side, and that will continue to help us. These allies will continue to help us over the years. So the important lessons, as we have already said earlier, is being relentless, and I think now we can easily use print and social media to promote our cause. to me, it's also important to get involved. I got involved in training women to be relentless lobbyists and implementers, especially getting more women involved and they themselves grab the opportunities when it comes. So you can ask for 30% quota, but if you don't train enough women to take those opportunity, to take those positions when it's open, then we are also in that losing side. So do continue to also be there to train women. And that's what I have done together with NGOs here, Pakostras, SAWO. These are groups, local groups that we have. And of course, AIPP, the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, have been supportive for many of us in different countries in Asia. And I think even in here in Malaysia, we managed to get the government to support the World Indigenous Peoples Day celebration so that, we can raise public awareness. And of course, it's sometimes we ourselves need to challenge. I mean, this is my personal experience where in my own case, my entry into local government and later into politics as a legislative assembly member was a completely different path after 35 years in NGO. So at the international level, now I think there's a lot of younger women being involved. We have to work very hard to include Indigenous women's rights in the agenda when international instruments are discussed. I think I've seen many human rights officers now who are women, and they will willingly include women agenda and issues. So work with them. I think we have to be willing to be fully engaged and work to get Indigenous women's point of view. We're still talking about lack of disaggregated data, not enough studies to differentiate between impacts of on Indigenous and non-Indigenous women. Often it's difficult to propose recommendations that are specific to Indigenous women. So we have to deeply reflect ourselves and come up with good ideas. Another challenge we face usually is women, when we go for international global meetings, we get Indigenous women from all backgrounds, and we need to get them to agree on key issues, positions, and action points to be included in statements or plan of action at the UN meetings. So often Indigenous women leaders are very vocal, very insistent on the ideas, and may not be willing to compromise. So, and this could, as we heard earlier, complicated by resistance from our own male Indigenous leaders. So I think we need to battle and form a cohesive way to work together and come up with ideas to ensure that what we achieve and what we are proposing is something that at the global level is acceptable to Indigenous women. So I think these are just some of my personal and also in terms of a response to where you are just now. So I hope that is helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. We're running out of time, but let me just briefly say that with all the setbacks that we are facing today, there's a seemingly very long way to go yet, no? But we are advancing. We are advancing, as you have heard, no, from our speakers and from the share, despite all these setbacks. So it's up to us now to take on these opportunities provided by international instruments and mechanisms to advance. And we have to do this holding hands with the youth and the broader sector. So as to ways forward, there's still a demand for capacity building for Indigenous women in relation to knowledge and skills to use these opportunities. trying to own our own advocacies in our initiatives and work on advancing social justice and equity for Indigenous women. So with this, I would like to thank everyone. Thank you, Vicky, Tanya, Sandra, and Johnny for taking time to be with us with your very rich insights for this panel today. I hate to end this very rich discussion, but time is our enemy as usual. Thank you also all to our sisters out there participating from a distance, and a big appreciation for FIMI and its team who have been moving mountains to bring us all together here. Please, let's give them a virtual clap. And thank you, everyone, and have a very fruitful day ahead.
Thank you, Ellen, for such smooth moderation of the session. And as Sandra said, we are rising as Indigenous peoples. Indeed, we are rising as a collective force from the local to the global level and getting stronger now. Thank you so much to Vicky, Tanya, Sandra, and Jenny for your deep and analytical reflections, where you let us see that Indigenous women are transforming the international agenda, guided by the realities of our communities, despite the prevalent challenges that we are facing. Thank you for sharing the powerful voices of Indigenous women influencing the international agenda based on the priorities from the grassroots. And that's too far from the Indigenous women's perspective. A very warm Indigenous greetings to Indigenous sisters, brothers, representatives from the government, UN agencies, our very close allies, and networks across the globe. I'm Chanda Thapa, and I belong to Mogar Indigenous peoples from Nepal. I'm currently working with National Indigenous Women Forum, Nepal, and also associated with FIMI in the process of this Second World Conference. Thank you again for joining us on the day 2 of the Second World Conference of the Indigenous Women. I'd like to start this session with a video prepared by African Indigenous Women's Organization, in which an urgent call is made by Indigenous women in Africa. They have had a very consultative process in their region, and then hence this outcome has been depicted in the form of this video. And it is the same call to action by Indigenous women around the world for the states to fulfill their commitment made through international instruments at the local and national level. So let's watch the video. Africa. You have already come up with a very clear positions and demands regarding to your rights. Thank you so much. Let's move to the next segment as we are running behind the time. In this session, we will be discussing, reflecting and sharing experiences on different advocacy tools initiated and developed by Indigenous movement for the realization of the rights of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women in particular. So first of all, I'd like to invite Sister Tarsila Rivera-Gia and Tapio Keyas. Tarsila, of course, no need, she doesn't need any introduction, but yeah, she's the president of Chirapac Center for Indigenous Cultures of Peru and the former member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. She will be joined by Tapio. He's the team member of Chirapac and also an expert in international advocacy and the rights of Indigenous peoples, women, children, and youth. So they have created a platform, very interesting platform called yanapac.info to put together all the recommendations from the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, UNPFII. So it allows us to learn about the proposals that have emerged from this forum to exercise our rights and also to discover opportunities to do so. The objective of this tool is to find in the UNPFII recommendation database and recommendations that will allow us to argue before our governments. So more information will be shared by Tarsila and Tapio. Yes, the floor is yours, Tarsila, and Tapio can take over after that. Thank you so much.
Sí. Good morning, sisters from over the world. I'm very happy to listen you, to see you, and we are very healthy and very strong. Con esto voy a hablar en español. Uy, ¿qué se hace en español? Discúlpenme. Simplemente, queridas hermanas, escuchando a las hermanas lideresas que nos han precedido y nos han compartido tanta experiencia, tanta visión de lo que hemos hecho y lo que nos falta por hacer, y pensando en los mecanismos y los instrumentos y las herramientas que debemos usar para la incidencia, desde Chirapac tenemos el Yanapac Info justamente para acceder a información que pueda ser útil para nuestras acciones de incidencia tanto en el plano internacional como en nuestros países. Y vamos a compartir con ustedes a través de Tapio esta herramienta que se nos ocurrió y lo parimos cuando fuimos integrantes del foro permanente hasta el 2019 y hemos comprobado que es muy útil y muy simple, además de otras iniciativas que existen, ¿no? Tapio, te dejo la palabra.
Thank you, Tarsila. Good morning to everyone. Good evening. Good afternoon. Okay, now we are going to introduce this tool called yanapac.info. That, as was said, is a browser that enables us to access easily to more than 1,500 recommendations issued by the UN Permanent Forum. Each one of these recommendations includes goals, strategic orientations, and possible future actions addressed to governments, the UN system, and other actors. Actually, the yanapac.info responds directly to the lack of visibility, the lack of follow-up, and the lack of implementation of these recommendations. Even though these recommendations are not legally binding, actually all of these recommendations are directly linked to other global agreements made by the states, such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and also the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda. So in this sense, also the indigenous peoples and indigenous women's organizations have a leading role in advocacy work for the implementation of the recommendations. So access to these recommendations allows us to strengthen the political argumentation of our advocacy work, also learn about the indigenous agenda that is backed by the UN system, and also an input to design proposals for public policies, programs, and norms. Now I would like to share my screen so that you can see the yanapah.info homepage. It's actually quite easy to use this tool. We just need to use keywords, any relevant topic that we would like to search, and then use different filters to narrow our result. When we created Yanapah, actually we linked all of these recommendations to 70 keywords, such as interculturality, intellectual property, traditional medicine, environment, funding, empowerment, and so on. We have also linked all of these recommendations to the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda and the articles of the UN DRIP, of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So now I'm going to show you how to use this tool by using 3 examples. For example, if your organization has been invited to participate in a consultation process to design national policy on climate change, and we would like to know if there are any recommendations on indigenous women and climate change, we can first right here type the word women, for example, and click on search button. Okay, now we can find that there are 211 recommendations on this topic that are specifically related to the rights of indigenous women. We don't need to read all of them. Instead, we can use a filter to narrow our result. So we can find the keyword climate change here. Click the title of the keyword, and now we find 6 recommendations that are related to indigenous women and climate change. So, for example, the second one says that the crucial role of indigenous women and indigenous youth should be ensured by the states in developing mitigation and adaptation measures when designing climate change policy. Then we will see another example, because we can use these recommendations not only for international advocacy, but also on national or local levels. For example, if your organization is planning to start advocacy campaign to make visible the criminalizations against indigenous midwives, we can also find if there are any recommendations on this topic. So we can find, we can write here, for example, midwife or midwifery, and click on search tool. Okay, now we can see that there are 8 recommendations on this topic. And when we click the title of the recommendation, we can see the full information of the recommendation. For example, this recommendation is quite long. I can find an important that they book to criminal wife and make the necessary the amendments to legitimize indigenous midwives recognized by their communities as healthcare providers. As we have linked all these recommendations, we can see here, for example, that this recommendation contributes directly to reaching the goal number 3 on good health and well-being. This recommendation is also related to Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination, as stated in the Article 3 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So now we will still see one more example. In this conference, one topic, one process that has been mentioned many times is the specific recommendations of the CEDAW Committee on Rights of Indigenous Women and Girls. So if you want to know the recommendations of the UN Permanent Forum on this topic, we can also type CEDAW and click on the search button. And there are only 3 recommendations on the topic. And an interesting point here is that there's already a recommendation from the year 2004 that recommends the states to start a process to, and the UN system to start process to build this recommendation. And then when we scroll down the list of the results, we see a recommendation that was reiterated on 2019 on this the same topic. When we have this result, we can also download the results and share these by email or print them or share by WhatsApp and other media. In the following weeks, we will update the page and also upload the recommendations that the Permanent Forum made this year. So you can also this page in the following weeks to find the new recommendations. Lastly, I would like to invite, in the name of Chirapa, Center for Indigenous Culture of Peru, all of you to visit yanapaf.info to learn more about this tool and also use the UN Permanent Forum recommendations to promote the rights of Indigenous people, women, children and youth at all levels. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sister Tarsia, and then Tarsilia and Tapio for a very informative session. I think it's I think not only me who have heard about this website for the first time. There might be a lot of other Indigenous sisters also. This is very, very useful. That this recommendation, which you mentioned, like 1,500 recommendation issued by the UN Permanent Forum, which we can definitely use for our advocacy work at national to international level. And I think it's very easy also. The search engine is also very easy. I'm like the search engine also developed in a very easy way to access the desired information. So I think, thank you so much. I think our sisters will definitely be using this information for their advocacy work. With thanking to both of you, I'd like to move to the next segment, where we will be discussing about another Indigenous, it's called Indigenous Navigator, which is another powerful tool, advocacy tool developed to monitor like the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, core human rights conventions related to Indigenous peoples. It also looks after the essential aspects of the Sustainable Development Goal and including the outcome of World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. So basically these 4 areas that it looks into. So it is a framework. I think some of you are already familiar of this tool, as you are also implementing some projects related to Indigenous Navigator in Asia, Africa, and then other regions as well. So it is a framework and set of tools developed for and by Indigenous peoples to monitor the level of recognition and implementation of their rights. So through the use of these tools, Indigenous organizations and communities, NGOs, even journalists can access to free tools and resources based on data generated by indigenous community themselves. So I think the very valuable, very important part of this tool is it's generated by indigenous communities. So thus, for example, the vitality of an indigenous language can be measured on a scale, for example, from 0 to 10, extinct to secure, securing right to lands, using the so-called index tool. So there are like different ways of like monitoring of different thematic topics that it has already listed. So we will see more in the video, the next video that we are going to present. So this Indigenous Navigator is a collaborative initiative carried out with the support of the European Union by a consortium of 6 partners. So Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, AIPP, Danish Institute for Human Rights, the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, Forest Right Program, and Tepteva Foundation. So these 6 consortium members are implementing it through their members and partners in different parts of the world. So let's watch the video for more detailed information, which will share about who are we and what are our rights through this Indigenous Navigator. Thank you.
We are over 5,000 different indigenous peoples worldwide, comprising 476 million individuals in 90 countries. All indigenous communities are culturally distinct, but we face many of the same human rights challenges. Across the globe, we experience discrimination, marginalization, and exclusion from political processes and decision-making that affect our lives. Our rights to lands, territories, and natural resources are often not respected. This severely impacts our livelihoods, food security, and well-being. We are also 3 times more likely than other people to live in extreme poverty, making us more vulnerable to the impact of climate change and to the devastating effects of COVID-19. It is critical to document and raise awareness about our human rights situation. That's why the Indigenous Navigator was created, to provide a set of tools to monitor the recognition and implementation of our rights worldwide. The Indigenous Navigator is developed by a number of indigenous peoples and human rights organizations. The online tools and resources help indigenous communities to collect data on the community and the national situation. The tools cover essential thematic areas. These include rights to self-determination, lands, territories, and resources, as well as health and education. Monitoring of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and other human rights and labor instruments are built into the tools. And so are all the Sustainable Development Goals related to Indigenous peoples' rights. Thereby, the Indigenous Navigator can be used to monitor both the most important human rights instruments and the Sustainable Development Goals. The collected data is presented in comprehensive national and community reports and can be visualized, explored, and compared in our online portal. By documenting and reporting our own situations, we can enhance our access to justice and development and help document the situation of Indigenous peoples globally. Indigenous communities can use the data to advocate for their rights at the local, national, and international level. It can also help to hold states accountable by monitoring their compliance with or failure to meet human rights obligations with regards to Indigenous peoples. Many Indigenous communities have already benefited from the Indigenous Navigator's tools. One of these is Okani, a community-based Indigenous organization located in Cameroon. Using the tool to collect data at the community level, Okani was able to record the number of community members who don't have birth certificates and national identity cards. Without these documents, they are unable to vote, apply for jobs, or move freely around the country. This data provided Okani with important advocacy materials which helped them to take action. In this way, the Indigenous Navigator can support and strengthen the self-determined governance and empower us to claim our rights. For more information, go online at indigenousnavigator.org.
Okay, so we hope this video gave you more clear information about. There is also a separate website about to learn more about the Indigenous Navigator. Okay, so let's move to the third presentation. So I'd like to request Ms. Aminata Gambo. She belongs to Mokoro Fulani Indigenous peoples of Cameroon. She has been active in the promotion and protection of the rights of Indigenous people since 2011. She's currently working as a coordinator of the Participation and Advocacy Program of the International Indigenous Women's Forum, FIMI. So Aminata will be sharing with us about the global study on the situation of Indigenous women and girls, which was published by FIMI in the framework of the 25th anniversary of Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action in collaboration with the regional networks. So from just borrowing the words from Famjiri Malambo Guga, she's the Executive Director of UN Women. In her forewords in the global study, she says, we hope that this study will become a reference group for the design of public policies, budgets and programs that are relevant for and with Indigenous women and girls. So I think with this statement itself, we can understand like how important this study has been, which can be used as an advocacy tool by Indigenous women and girls. So Amina will be sharing more information. So the floor is yours, Amina. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Thank you, Chandra, for giving me the space. Like Chandra already mentioned, I'll be sharing a little bit of information regarding the global study that was prepared by FIMI in collaboration with the regional networks. So the global study on the situation of Indigenous women was prepared in 2020, and it outlined the progress, the challenges, and some of the good practices led by Indigenous women from the Americas, Asia, Africa, Arctic, and the Pacific. And this is in relation to the 12 critical areas of concern of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. The global study was compiled using information that was provided by the regions, which was prepared by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous consultants. This was done in close collaboration with the FIMI board members who are representative of each of the regions respectively. They gave their approval on the final content of the regional studies, ensuring that the voices and experience of Indigenous women at all levels were reflected. So in this global study, some of the main findings of the studies included, like I mentioned earlier, the progress and the challenges. So some of the progress that was highlighted in the study included, it mentioned that after the Beijing conference, there was a high increase in the establishment of regional and global Indigenous women organizations and movements. It also highlighted the increase of political participation of Indigenous women, both at the national and international level, thanks to the fact that it strengthened the Indigenous women organizations through their advocacy work. It also mentioned that Indigenous women have been building alliances among themselves and with other social organizations and movements. It mentioned that several cultural land-based programs have been created and successfully implemented by Indigenous women and Indigenous women organizations at a global level. It also highlighted that Indigenous women no longer see themselves as victims, but more of taking the roles to be the mediators and peace builders. Lastly, it also mentions the progress that Indigenous women communicators and filmmakers routinely hold meetings and film screening related Indigenous women lives and violence related It also shows that there's a high migration of indigenous women moving from the rural to the urban areas, which it was documented in all the regions. It also shows the limited economic opportunities, food insecurities, land dispositions, and lack of basic social services, among other factors. In the Americas, for example, indigenous women continue to be underrepresented in political spaces, both in elected and appointed spaces. The report shows that about 304 human rights defenders were killed in 2019, alone globally, 13% of whom were women and 40% were engaged on land rights issues. It shows that mental health issues and high suicide rates are crucial issues among indigenous women living in the Arctic region. And also in Canada, the Inuit women have registered lowest level of educational attainment. So it also has basic conclusions and recommendations that were made to both government, UN agencies, and also other stakeholders. It highlighted that the global study from all the regions have registered structural violence, discrimination, and marginalization. And also it shows that there's a reluctance of states, for example, in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific to recognize indigenous people. It still presents the main critical issues for the protection of the right of indigenous women. It also mentioned that the COVID-19 pandemic has led to a barrier of inequality both between and within countries according to gender, race, ethnicity, and so on. The global study also outlined how the situation of indigenous women cannot be properly described and understood without referring to individual and collective rights simultaneously. Just to mention that we do have this global study available in 4 different languages on the FIMI website. Languages include Spanish, French, Russian, and English. For those of you who have not yet had the opportunity to read it, you'll be able to find it there. Or if you wish, you can contact us directly. We can provide you with a copy of the study. We also have the regional studies that I mentioned that the global study was based on the regional studies. All the regional studies from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and North America, and then we also have Arctic and Pacific. We have 5 regional reports at the FIMI website as well. So if you have any questions or if you're interested in this book, I would encourage you to read it, use it both at the local and national levels for your advocacy tool. Thank you, Chandra, for giving me the floor, and you may take over now.
Okay, thank you so much, Amina, for the presentation and sharing more detailed information about the study. Of course, I think not only in Asia, Africa, but other regions also, indigenous women are facing the issue related to non-recognition as indigenous women, as indigenous people. So that's also the reason they are facing a lot of challenges, especially they are far behind in exercising their even the fundamental rights. So as Amina said, this report is, you can access the report in FIMI's website. I think someone from the FIMI team will also share the link in the chat box to get more detailed information. So yes, we are a little bit behind the time. So yes, thank you so much to all the presenters, Tashila, Tapio, Amina, and then you also, hopefully you got more information about the different advocacy tools that have been initiated and developed by different indigenous peoples, human rights organizations, and then how they are using at the ground level and how as indigenous women we can benefit out of it in terms of advocating for our rights. So I think these very important 3 platforms, these 3 tools, such as a platform like Yanapak.info, Indigenous Navigator, and Global Study that was conducted by FIMI, will be helping further Reason from Siberia, who belong to the Sami Song Forum. So you will hear watch a very beautiful song video from our sisters from Siberia. Then I'd like to hand over to Has, who will be taking over the next session for sharing more detailed information about the interactive sessions. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. Hope you have a good day. Thank you.
Чумагула, махан, чумагула, мимо чого гетілим багаут, факваргаут, кудел паргер, чилдемі ген пігелем ба. Кула, ман, криджедел кула, міна ганцану гелгрей, нагула, міна неяр, кричия, Тебелгула мага того чекор, клаєш пагаде, табла магаджон, кладеш пагаде, хурула, кайна я, ларем багаде. Чел душили йохаши, мішал деміген койвати, Чел душили йохаши, мешал демиген койвати. Он штобет айтермел, кажен ми коен чест. Илгожима пачебо тижи, чадам бачелом дерогат коп. Чел душили йохаши, мешал демиген койвати. Чел душили йохаши, мешал демиген койвати. Акол чуме, акол надек, акол ханжеру хайола, кандук манебенде кулемде, тайгана кече акунжеле. Чел душили йохаши, мешал демиган койвати. Чел душили йохаши, мешал демиган койвати. Чумел крибаче, тапкадеш патквелет плач, Мирджик шалбал тап не шалба, хайо еманим бехап. Чел душили йохаши, мешал демиган койвати. Чел душили йохаши, мешал демиган койвати.
Thank you. Also, panelists have stated the challenge for implementation at the local level is key, and also it's important to make visible how Indigenous women are influencing and contributing to the implementation, recognizing the great existence of advocacy tools such as Joignez-vous, the Indigenous Navigator, and the Global Study of Indigenous Women Forum. As we could see before, with the goal of continuing the deep conversation after the break, we will go to the interactive sessions to learn, be more inspired, and share our recommendations so that the international instruments become living documents. For now, please, you are welcome for a break moment, and for those who wish to stay here with us, you can enjoy the presentation of the videos prepared by our sisters of African Indigenous Women's Organization and short Indigenous films produced by Wakipon. Please have in mind that after this break, we wait for you in the interactive session. You can access through 3 ways. First, you can find the links of all the sessions in the chat room. Second, it was sent through emails before. And the third one, for those who have access to internet, you only need to select the session of your interest. There will be 5 interactive sessions, so 5 rooms. Each chat will be providing the links 10 minutes before the beginning of the session. So please, let's go to the break. You
Las mujeres alimentan nuestro planeta. Silenciosamente mueven el mundo agrícola. Ellas producen más de la mitad de los alimentos que consumimos cada día. Nuestra comida es el producto del trabajo de muchas mujeres. Ellas velan por nuestra seguridad alimentaria. Su trabajo puede parecer sin importancia, pero es vital para la humanidad. A ellas no se les paga con dinero. Ellas no poseen las tierras que cultivan. No fueron a la escuela. Los bancos no les prestan dinero. Estén donde estén, aseguran la subsistencia. Sin embargo, saben mantener la vida. Cultivan y distribuyen los alimentos. Adultas, adolescentes o pequeñas son las primeras víctimas de la malnutrición. Paradoxalmente, son ellas las proveedoras. Son ellas quienes producen. Son ellas las emprendedoras. Démosle las mismas posibilidades que a los hombres. Iluminemos sus esperanzas. Exijan para ellas justicia. Únanse con ellas, sean solidarios y verán que cuando justicia sea hecha, el sol brillará más alto.